Good evening. We're going to get started. I apologize for those of you that saw an original email that said this lecture was going to start at 5:30, and we changed that, and hopefully it got out to you that said 5:45. So we're only 5 minutes late and not 20 minutes late, but I apologize for those of you that are thinking, why didn't you get this thing going on time? Welcome to tonight's lecture. I'm Michael Fifield, faculty member in the Department of Architecture here at the U of O. This is actually our first lecture of the academic year. We did have one planned previously with David Lake of Lake Flato Architects in San Antonio a few weeks ago, but there was a huge electrical storm in San Antonio and he couldn't get out of town on an airplane, so he never arrived. And so, but we're fortunate that tonight's presenter did make it here. Not only did Chuck Durrett make it here tonight, but he also was generous in his time last night in working with about 25 graduate students in what was intended to be a 3-hour seminar with them that lasted another half hour beyond that, and then we had to stop at that particular point, but then he went out having a beer or two with 5 or 6 students afterwards. And so there's obviously quite a bit of interest in the subject matter of cohousing. And Chuck is the person in the United States that's going to be able to be the definitive expert on this. And just real briefly, give you a little bit of background. And I think those of you that are really sort of interested in cohousing know of Chuck's books. First book that he co-authored, Cohousing, then more recently, Senior Cohousing Handbook. His firm that primarily is working in cohousing, but other housing issues also and building types is primary office is in Nevada City, California, where he has a group of individuals, including himself, that are working on cohousing projects not only in California but across the United States. He has studied cohousing in Denmark. He's quite the expert not only locally but nationally in terms of being asked to come and work with individual groups that are interested in doing cohousing projects. And next month, and he'll probably talk a little bit about this, on November 14th and 15th, I believe, he's doing a cohousing workshop here in Eugene for individuals that are interested in that. He's done over 50 cohousing projects that have been built within the United States. So obviously he's the person, when there aren't that many cohousing projects in the United States, he's done the majority of them by far. So what the format tonight is going to be is I need to make a couple announcements. If you do have a cell phone or anything other electronic, please turn that off. For those of you that are AIA members, there's continuing education credits, and I'll put this up front so not that you would leave early, but it forces you to sort of stay. Put it up here to the side so you can sign that if you want to. And at the end, we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers. And we probably need to leave. We can't keep that for too long because we have some other commitments that Chuck's going to be involved in after that. But thank you for coming tonight, and please welcome Chuck.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. Thank you and welcome, everybody, for coming tonight. Whoops. Assuming I can get wired for sound here. Co-housing. Well, how did I get started with this crazy notion anyway of designing custom-made neighborhoods? That's basically what it is. It's folks getting together and deciding that whatever else is on the market doesn't make sense for them, and that their neighborhood is actually an important part of their life. A viable neighborhood is an important part of their quality of life. You know, like their family life and the larger community life, the neighborhood actually plays a role, and not only in their quality of life, but definitely in terms of living lighter on the planet. I sincerely believe that, I live with 33 other households in a co-housing community. This one here, actually, Nevada City Cohousing. And, my electric bill last year was minus $83.84. The average for that co-housing community is minus $50 a year. And that's just one of 100 indicators. We occupy less than 10% as much property as we did collectively previous. And I'll give you some other stats on that in a minute. But not one of the 34 households had any photovoltaic. Uh-oh. Somebody said I better keep tapping it to keep it going. You can't? Oh, thank you. So, let's see what I can do about that. And by the way, if you actually are hard of hearing, you might come up closer to the front. So they don't blow out the people who are things up.
I think you lost your mic.
Is that right? Maybe because I put it in my pocket. Can you hear me now?
That's better.
That's better? But I need the mic.
Well, it's not.
Mic isn't working.
Here comes Wade. Wade's our technical guy. Wade, you're telling me it's not working. But before Wade gets to this, they're going to figure it out. No. Is that better? No, not really. Is that better? Is that better? How come? You heard Michael okay though?
It just cut out.
So.
Yeah. Co-listening, you know?
Yeah, the front row tell the back row what's happening. How about that? Don't have to hold it.
If everybody moves to the front, we can all hear without the mic.
Usually I don't need a mic, but this room is so appropriate, which is nice, that the mic seems to be essential. But yes, I would like to encourage folks to move up front and be even cozier. And now I get, oh, there we go. All right. Do you have another one of these boxes? Well, I'm not going to stop. Why does that thing keep going blank on me? So literally, I mean, if I delay for a second, it goes blank. So I'll try to move it along. Okay, so can we go? That's all right. Okay, I'm going to speak louder. Where was I? Yeah, Nevada City Cohousing. You know, I got interested in cohousing when I was going to the University of Copenhagen in 1980. And it wasn't because of something I learned about in school. It was because every day I was walking to the train to go to school. Every day I was walking through this neighborhood and I noticed that there was a single-family houses, no life between the buildings. Apartments, no life. Condos, no life. There happened to be an assisted care, no life between the buildings. Then there was this one neighborhood that I walked past day after day, and I marveled at how there was almost always somebody outside between the buildings, almost always somebody in the neighborhood chatting with other people in the neighborhood, whether they were stopping at the picnic table and having a cup of tea, or sitting around the sandbox while 4 or 5 kids were playing, or the kids were running around, Or people were coming and going to this building where apparently nobody lived, but everybody lived somehow, later learned was the common house. And so finally one day, after seeing this month after month, finally one day I stopped and I said, what's going on here? I don't get it. It's a very unusual neighborhood. And this woman said, well, have a seat and have a cup of tea. And she proceeded to explain how her and her husband, in this case, had actually bought this site and decided that, they wanted to live in a high-functioning neighborhood, a very high-functioning neighborhood, where, the residents would chat with each other, discuss the issues of the day, resolve mutual concerns. And she really very much described it like a high-functioning family, where people talked about the issues of the day and resolved mutual concerns. And she felt in her mind that it was, the neighborhood was an important element, not only in terms of the individuals of the people that lived there, but building a viable city and, by translation, building a viable society to have a functioning neighborhood. I mean, I heard so many things along those lines, like how could you go out there and strive for world peace, for example, if you don't even know how to communicate with your neighbor, and don't even know how to resolve issues with the person who lives next door, and don't know how to make purchases in your neighborhood with your neighbors, not having to rely on the city or somebody else, some authority figure to do things, that you could actually play a part in the role, besides just saying no to the city and why don't you do this to the city, etc. Why don't you play a role? So anyway, she was describing to me what I began to believe is a really conservative effort. These were people who felt like the neighborhood was important and they weren't going to take any chances. They weren't going to risk living in a neighborhood that was not high functioning. They wanted to live in a neighborhood that was. And they weren't going to buy, what they considered to be brand X neighborhoods, which was something that some developer had come up with based on making a profit and making a profit only, based on what they saw in the rearview mirror. In other words, that sold last time, so I think it'll work. If I make some more of those, it'll probably sell. Even if more of those doesn't do much in terms of building a viable society, if it puts boxes equidistant across the landscape, more or less estranges the population and doesn't necessarily contribute to people knowing each other. Oh, now I really screwed up. Whoops. Okay, good. So anyway, that co-housing community kind of felt like this, where when I walk home after work, I feel like, my neighbors are actually an important amenity in my life. I can stop and chat with them and be entertained, or I can stop and chat with them and resolve mutual concerns, whether it's, cut the tree down, don't cut the tree down, build new of this, don't build new of that, whatever the issues are. That's almost academic. The reality is I have these people that I sit down and talk about it with and resolve it with and increasingly learn how to do so. So anyway, there's for those of you who are not really familiar with co-housing, there's 4 key components. One is that the future residents actually play a very large role in deciding, what the neighborhood's going to feel like, look like, what the scale, etc., where the parking is going to be, where it's not going to be. It hasn't been pre-formatted by anybody else. It's a very proactive, engaging exercise where we actually spend, in case of the site plan, 4 days, two weekend days and a Monday and a Tuesday night, and very much format the landscape based on these values, based on their values. My job really is, whether it's 30 people in the room, 40 people in the room, or in the case of this one, 50 people in the room, deciding what makes sense for that group in the context of their values. And for this place, for example, child-friendly, elderly-friendly was really top of the priority list. No cars anywhere around. It's 700-foot walk from my parking place to my house, and I'm fine with it because I believe that my neighbors actually play a role in the quality of life, and they're more or less an amenity. So I don't mind the fact. Interestingly enough, we have a 91-year-old resident, Meg Polly. She used to live by the park, closer to the parking lot where the one-story adaptable, very accessible unit was. She said, to heck with that, I want to move to the back. I want to be able to walk all the way to the very back of the project and see my neighbors when I come home, even if she's in a walker. So it's interesting how when you get involved with real people and your job is to manifest their values, it's always surprising, and it's quite often very antithetical to what the experts say. elderly people, they have to have their little accessible unit, they have to be near their car, and all the rest. Meg said, forget that. She's a very self-deterministic person. She says, I want to have a 700-foot walk to my house. And she happens to live in a 2-story house now, too. So she's very self-deterministic. And I couldn't imagine telling her, you should do this. She's very clear about what works and what doesn't work for her. Anyway, very proactive in terms of making a neighborhood that is human scale. And the second component is, generally speaking, is that the design is done in such a way that it really facilitates community over time. These folks are very much a community when they move in. They've been planning their project for a year or so. But architecturally, after you move in and the honeymoon has worn off, theory is that the community, the architecture itself actually plays a role in keeping people connected. That dialogue occurs in the planning process, and so people, in fact, say, well, let's definitely, not only for ecological purposes, et cetera, but let's definitely keep the parking to the periphery so that we can stay connected with our neighbors. So, designing these projects so that they feel like a neighborhood over time. In fact, in this community, we did an exercise that we do always, which is we get the folks, we asked in this case the folks line up in a huge parking lot that we went to, and 110 feet face-to-face from each other. And then then I generated this scenario where I was describing, imagine that you had dinner in the common house the night before with your neighbor, and she was talking about later that night she was going to have a difficult conversation with her daughter, let's say, who is having personal troubles, and you care about that person who's 110 feet away from you. I had them line up in 2 lines, 110 feet, line up with opposing another person not in their family. So then I said, okay, so open the door to your house. Imagine it's 8:30 in the morning, and you're getting ready to go to work, and your other neighbor is 110 feet away. She opens her door, and she's getting ready to work. Imagine that's the person you had the conversation with. Imagine that you care about this person at some basic level, and you're just kind of curious how the conversation went. You're not prying necessarily, but you're thinking maybe later I'll call them up because I'm concerned based on the mood I see when I see them in the morning. And this is how far I want both of you guys to walk towards each other until one of you are no longer comfortable getting any closer to the other. And that's where your front doors are going to be. When we had actually 11 acres in this project to work with. So for 34 houses, actually turned out to be 48, 14 of them not being the co-housing, but that's not important. We started with the 34. So I want you to walk towards each other until you feel uncomfortable being any closer. 110 feet, because that's typical distance from front door to front door in a typical brand new neighborhood. So, that would be the default in the generation of a new neighborhood. Where my sister lives on Tyler and 12th Street, it's about 95 feet front door to front door. Nice old neighborhood done in the 20s. The neighborhoods were a little bit more intimate than they are nowadays, where they tend to get a little further apart. But anyway, so I had them walk towards each other until they were all stopped, and then I took the measurements from the closest distance to the furthest distance, and the whole the whole distances were 26 feet to 40 feet. So these are 26 feet, front door to front door. They could have stayed at 110 feet. And one of the things I'm always amazed by is that when you actually get future residents at the party, they never ask for, what's regular default development. And that's one of the things I really like about designing co-housing. The third thing is that it's typically very extensive common facilities. This happens to be the Fresno co-housing, and that really supplement the private houses. Even though when we start a new project, we always say to the group, why have a common house at all? It's $300,000, $350,000. You don't have one now. Why would we spend that money doing that? And it's amazing once you start the ball rolling of all the things that you can do together better than you can do on your own, in your own house. I mean, you have a private house, of course. Everybody in co-housing has a private house and a common house. But what are the activities that we can do better together than one would do alone? In some ways, co-housing is really adding a realm to the landscape. On the one hand, we have a private house. Everybody has a private house in co-housing and has a private house in general to to accommodate their private needs. And we have the public realm, hospitals, roads, schools. But the co-housing is this realm where there's a scale of people that's basically about this number, which we can do things better together than we could actually do at those other two scales at all. You know, like we have this state-of-the-art workshop. And I don't know if you know, I could have never afforded, you know, $300 table saw and, you know, $500 sander and all that stuff that we have there. But together, all that stuff, you know, $400 bike stand, state-of-the-art, it's easy to fix your bike. But together, it was very easy to afford. That's part of it. But on the other hand, you know all these people, so I know I just use the workshop on Sunday night, and I know that I don't want to leave a mess because I'll upset so-and-so and so-and-so. So it's an accountable scale. Common is you can scale up, you know, amortize a lot of other additional costs, but scale down enough so that it's accountable and it's easy to cooperate. So anyway, the common facilities end up becoming quite extensive. And in the design, it's designed in a way to be, you know, again, very responsive. They're quite varied from project to project. This happens to be the Bellingham Cohousing north of Seattle. And this group, oh, you know what I forgot to do? I forgot to fix the lights a little bit. Let me do this here. Let's see. Did anybody even, is that better? Let me see if I can. Whoops, I'm sorry. Oh, that's better. That's worse. Whoops, that's worse. Yeah, I know. You should see this thing. It looks like Star Trek up here. It's so high-tech, it's impossible. Whoops. Okay, I'm going to try this one more time. Wade, I need you again. Okay, good. If you could bring it way down, especially this one, I'd appreciate it. This happens to be Bellingham Cohousing, and they were very adamant from the beginning. Chuck, you know, we really like to dance. We're into dancing. So, you know, they happened to move into their cohousing on May 12th, 2000, and I was really amazed. You know, we sprung the floor and made the lights so that they were easy to raise, etc. But boom, right, first night they moved the tables out of the way. They started dancing, and I thought, oh, okay, that's pretty cool. They were kind of serious. The next night, they did the same thing. So, I mean, they were really serious. And it's really amazing. If you get in there and you work with the culture and you're extremely responsive, you will see a collective activity that is, you know, in our common house, we do about 250 to 450 people hours a week. That's a lot of things and together, and it's all based on what makes my life better and what makes my life easier, more convenient, more practical, more economical, more interesting, more fun. You hear the same goals project after project, but they get manifested quite different from project to project. And the fourth thing, Wade, you could lose a little bit more lights. Can you hear me, Wade? I don't know if you can. Anyway, speaking of responsive, who programmed this place? He's actually behind that curtain over there, the guy who's running this place. Thank you. And then the fourth thing that's common to co-housing is that it's entirely self-managed. I mean, it really doesn't make any sense to have other people managing these people when they have, you know, created this place. They use common meetings, committee meetings. I meet about once a month with a committee, and I meet about once a month with the whole co-housing community. Who gets involved with co-housing? This happens to be Emeryville Cohousing. I lived here for 12 years. It's a very diverse group, like inner city projects. Munair here was from Jamaica. He was from South Korea. She was from Mexico. She was from China. She was from Great Britain. He was from China. An incredibly diverse group of people. But people often ask, what commonality do these folks have who participate in co-housing? Especially when I lived in Emeryville, where, you know, have a hot tub and you're sitting in the hot tub with some guest and they go, you know, what do you guys have together? Is there some spirituality here or something? You know, and I said, no. But I did have to figure out what it is. And I finally figured out what it was. And these are folks, individuals really, who really believe that their life will be better if they give cooperation with their neighbor the benefit of the doubt. And that's basically it. That's the only common denominator. If they give cooperation with their neighbor the benefit of the doubt. In other words, they cooperate when it makes sense and they don't cooperate when it doesn't make sense. When I lived here, one of these residents knocked on everybody's door and said, hey, I'm going to buy a pickup truck together. You want to buy one? No. Knock, knock. I'm going to buy a pickup truck together. You want to buy it together? No. Knock, knock. I'm going to buy a pickup. You want to buy one together? No. The point is that if it was a regular neighborhood and you went, down the street asking people if you want to buy a pickup together, I think it would have taken about 10 minutes before the police car showed up. But in this case, it was simply okay. It was allowed. It was understood that cooperation is always a possibility. And therefore, if it makes sense, we'll do it. If it doesn't make sense, we won't do it. So the 12 years I lived there, for 10 years, every single household only had one car because we did share 2 cars over the years. In other words, when it made sense, we did it. When it didn't make sense, we didn't do it. But we had the dialogue and we figured out when it made sense and when it didn't make sense. And whereas all too often it's too difficult to accomplish that at this scale anyway. A lot of things happen at the bigger scale, but a lot of things happen better at this scale. There's about 120 co-housing finished in the US now. All but 3 of them are intergenerational, very family-oriented, and people are chasing kids, having kids, being chased by kids. Where I live, there's 94 people altogether, 57 adults, 37 kids. It's extremely kid-friendly. I mean, it's kid heaven, frankly. And my kid grew up in co-housing. Katie and I only wanted to have one kid, mostly for ecological reasons. But our kid is incredibly social. It would have been nothing less than abusive to have only had one kid. And it's not that unusual, that terribly unusual for people to have a second kid just so that the first one won't have company. I just read yesterday on the front page of the Wall Street Journal that the average American kid today is watching TV 32 hours a week. It's unbelievable to me. I don't even know anybody in Nevada City Co-housing who has a TV, much less, the kids are outside playing with the other kids and everybody else all the time, and they're always playing, and doing stuff together. And anyway, oftentimes people say it's a place where adults can be adults and kids can be kids. After dinner especially, I don't know if you've noticed, but the adults want to kind of sink into their chair with their coffee, and the kids want to bounce off the walls. I mean, it's completely opposite, but setting up a world that sort of responds to those realities as best as you can instead of, don't do that, be still, be quiet. The kids' room is very active after a common house dinner. We have like I mentioned, a full-on workshop. The guys go there after common dinner and talk about their tools. And I never see them do anything. They have catalogs. They buy stuff. I think they actually purchased these cutoffs here, but they have a good time. That's good. They drink beer out there. A couple years ago, we actually won the best smart growth project in the U.S. by the Association of Home Builders in the U.S. And it's a 32-unit project that we did in downtown, a 30-unit project that we did in downtown Cotati. We also had commercial down below on the bottom of this building here that was on Main Street in downtown Cotati, which is about 50 miles north of San Francisco. I thought it was actually kind of interesting that we won first place for a smart growth project. Here's the 8 units above the commercial. Here's about 8,000 square foot of commercial. 22 units in the back, common house and the workshop there. And actually, one of the things that happened early on is the neighbors fought this project tooth and nail because the residents wanted to do all their own landscaping, and they weren't sure that the group would do a very good job, and so they fought it tooth and nail. Now, the landscaping, this is 1 year after they moved in. This is 1 year after they moved in. Oh, I have a slide somewhere in here. Hold on. No, I'll come back to it. I have a slide that I just took recently, their 5-year anniversary, where the neighbors were all coming for a tour of the landscaping. They have 2.2 acres. They have 77 fruit trees on site and just a plethora of planting. But anyway, it's amazing how it kind of amazes me that these guys won best project in the U.S. They're a very neophyte developer. Of course, they'd never developed anything previously. But they brought real important values to the table. You know, like I want a place where I can walk to my neighbor without having to interface with cars. I want a place where my 3-year-old could run outside and without interfacing with cars and run into other 3-year-olds. Those were the criteria for designing this neighborhood. Very human, very basic. It was not about, you know, we got to put pavement everywhere, and, you know, which is, I mean, I've worked for regular developers, and no matter how well-intended they are, no matter how green they want to be, there's always somebody that says, like the bank or the planning department, that says, no, we want to be able to drive to every house because otherwise the market won't accept it, or one thing or another. And, but anyway, these guys were able to insist on, look, we want to live here, we want to make a human-scale neighborhood, let us do it. Eventually people come around, they're the ones paying for it, and they're the ones planning it. But what amazes me is there's so many developers, especially around this project, who've been in business for 30 or 40 years. And they didn't do the project considered to be the best one. But something happens when your job is to ensconce real values of real people. The project gets real human scale, very basic human scale. And very livable, I think. This is actually pre-landscaping. You'll notice some other photos later where it's landscaped up. And day in and day out, there's a real life between the buildings. There's a real, everything they do is they do because it makes sense to this person, to this person, to this person. They don't do anything perfunctory. They don't have to do anything. But this is a choice they have. You hear over and over when people are planning a co-housing community that day in and day out, I feel like I have a choice between as much community as I want and as much privacy as I want. And before, I felt like my only choice was as much privacy as I wanted or as much privacy as I wanted. In other words, not much choice. And, you know, we all have a community. We have to. We're social animals. But it's based on our automobile, our date book, our telephone. And they wanted a community based on proximity. I could walk outside and be a part of something bigger than myself without having to, you know, make an appointment to do so. A project that we just finished in downtown Sacramento, which very, very challenging because it was a group that had been involved for some time. They were certain that the 1.25 acre parcel that they were considering was too small, mostly because there wasn't a lot of quality multifamily in Sacramento previously. It was all kind of cookie cutter, shoebox looking. You could hear the next door person, you know, there. So they actually came to Berkeley. We did a field trip, and I managed to convince them that we could do it on 1.25 acres successfully. And it's a very lovely neighborhood. They went ahead and bought the site, and it's a very, very nice courtyard scheme there. This is back to where I live, and trying to remember what I was going to say on this slide, other than you know, people walking back and forth. We use a lot of one of the things in this particular project, we have no air conditioners, but we have things like cupolas like this that facilitate airflow. No air conditioners. It's a very hot climate, fairly hot climate in Nevada City in the summertime, but we use a lot of passive cooling devices and a lot of natural light to bring in, you know, the light and not have to use electricity very often. I mean, I know a guy in Fresno who's got 6 kilowatts of new photovoltaics, roof's completely covered. He still has a couple $100. Really, it's not so much about the bells and whistles. It's very much about the emphasis, you know, the structure of how you make places and light places, and so that you never have to turn the lights on during the day, for example. This happens to be my house, and dawn to dusk, you never feel like you have to turn the light on at all because there's plenty of natural light in that space. Even though with this lighting, it's not obvious. In fact, there was my energy bill last year. That's my favorite slide, by the way. We just finished a project in Fresno, California, very hot. This is kind of a diagram of the typical co-housing where it's 2.8 acres, 28 units, very much based on a very pedestrian experience here, the common house, the teen room, et cetera, right there, the parking on the bottom, of course. This photo happens to be taken on June 21st, or it wasn't taken, but this drawing was done June 21st, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And the point is, you can't see any windows. Virtually can see no windows. It seems very simple. Passive cooling to me is very, very straightforward. One of the things I like about my job the most is doing these projects in all these different climates. This is, Fresno is an extremely hot climate for the most part, but the responding to it's very simple. This idea of, the big sombrero here, for example, you can't see any windows from the sun's point of view. This happens to be the common house. Now it's built, they moved in this year. And the windows are shaded by virtue of these large overhangs. And it's just it was very straightforward to respond. This happens to be back to Bellingham Co-Housing, 33 units on 5 acres. They decided to put all the units on 2.5 acres and keep half of it as a natural, part of it wetland, and keep the rest of it natural. That's very typical for co-housing groups. Once they start to deal with the realities of doing a project and the costs and the appropriate climate response, they really start to get it closer and closer and closer. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about working with these groups. They never say, I want sprawl, I want stuff spread out across the landscape. They usually have 3 priorities that come to the table, percolate to the top of the table in the context of planning a project, and that is they want it to be affordable, they want it to be very economical. That's affordable. That's one. They wanted to facilitate a sense of community, and they wanted to use as less energy as possible. So those 3 things, and that almost always means bringing it together, making it feel more like a village. Interesting thing about that project is this is all the houses built around it. You drive up and down that street, and it's one duplex after another, and this is the whole front yard in that project, all asphalt in this case. And it's quite unfortunate, really. But this project was actually slated to have those garage doors and use 32 units and use the whole 5 acres. I wish I had that site plan, but it completely blanketed the site. This happens to be Berkeley Co-Housing. It was a very, Berkeley, if you've been there before, it's a very eclectic town, neighborhood-wise. There's every kind of architecture going. And this group decided they wanted it to be very eclectic as well. So we did a craftsman, Victorian, country, Mediterranean. It was not the cheapest way to go, and normally I don't recommend it, but they were kind of insisting on it, so it was fine. Interestingly enough, I was walking through this site a few years ago with my father, and he goes, "Oh yeah, Chuck, I get it. This is the craftsman Scandinavian, this is the Victorian Scandinavian, this is the country Scandinavian, this is the Mediterranean Scandinavian." So, okay, you found me out. This is the Victorian Scandinavian. This is a 32-unit project in Vancouver, Washington. Covered street is not a terribly uncommon response in an inclement weather. This is that back to Emeryville, 12 units on 0.29 acres. The group started off with this old factory building, and then we basically made 4 units out of the factory, put 5 units on top, and then made 3 townhouses right here as well. That was also part of the old building. And we lived there for 12 years, as I mentioned. Since our first book came out in 1988, like I said, about 120 co-housing projects have been built. We studied Denmark in Denmark. We studied co-housing in Denmark for 13 months. Kate and I went back to write the book. And, but I went back a few years ago, and I wrote another book about senior co-housing. Currently, 20 out of the 25 new projects finished in Denmark are for seniors. The seniors have really figured this thing out, this co-housing thing, and found that the whole proximity thing really does play a huge role. Being in and around, being around people that you know and care about, making it easy to communicate with people that you know and care about, not having to drive to their house, etc., really plays a big role. How they figured it out was they started these classes, these night classes. This is one of the first graduating classes. They started these night classes called Aging Successfully. And it was all about seniors getting together, usually 20, 25, getting together and talking about, just amongst themselves, really what is the way that we want to format our lives physically and otherwise, that really sets us up for success. So they'd get into discussions about, the physiology of getting older, the reality physiologically of getting older, the reality emotionally of getting older. My kids have left town, my friends are leaving town or dying, one of us spouse might die someday, and so where are we going to be emotionally when that happens? I really started to feel like they were the ultra responsibles too. It reminded me of going to lunch with somebody and they said, well, let's see, you had the Caesar salad with the chicken and I had it without the chicken, so you owe it $6.75, I owe $6. But the point is that they were really taking accounting of the reality. They were not in denial. In fact, they always said that this Aging Successfully seminar only focused on 3 questions. One is the issue of becoming conscious of getting older. What's the realities physiologically, emotionally, psychologically, socially, economically, etc. And getting out of denial. Yes, we are getting older. We can't help it. It actually happens. We just get older. And thirdly, how to get self-deterministic. In other words, let's reformat our life so that it makes sense. They started these classes in 1985, and one of the things, I talked to a couple teachers who were facilitating the conversation. They said that what was so amazing is that everybody, or almost everybody, was doing something once they got out of the class, proactively. In other words, some of them were putting grab bars and ramps on their houses. Others were moving in with their sisters. Others were moving in with their daughters. They were buying a house with a friend. And about 40% of them were joining co-housing efforts because they had visited on the 10th session of this 10-session workshop. They were visiting co-housing communities, and they kept having this aha moment, which is quality of life for them was going to revolve around people that they cared about being in close proximity. And therefore, the co-housing made sense. So anyway, I visited a bunch of them and wrote the second book. And I have to say, every time I visited one of these projects, I felt like, wow, these people, these guys are, I haven't seen people have this much fun since the college dorms. Consistently. Consistently. Every time I stepped on site, I felt like, wow, this is almost as good as the college dorms again. And I was showing this slide recently, and somebody says, well, yeah, Chuck, look, just do the math. There's 9 people and 11 bottles of wine. I mean, the math's not that complicated, actually. Over and over, I was really impressed. These guys have dinner in their common house 5 nights a week. You don't have to participate. It's completely voluntary, but most people are there 5 nights a week in the common house or at the common house terrace. And like I said earlier, walk on site and, or even walk by the site and feel like there's a life between the buildings that's very unique. Over and over, consistently very unique to just about any other housing type that I'd ever visited. And as Sia said, she felt like she had as much community as she wanted outside and as much privacy inside as she wanted. Actually, I want to show this slide here for a second again because, when I first walked on this site, I, like every other visitor, was just amazed that half the houses were upstairs for seniors. And I asked him about it. What's going on with this exactly? And Mo in here says, well, Chuck, well, actually, everybody kind of made light of it at first, like it keeps us young and BS like that. But later, over wine, of course, somebody says, well, Chuck, here's the deal. We had farted around for a couple of years thinking that we wanted to make a co-housing. And we decided that we weren't getting anywhere. So we got our contractor and our architect together, and we said, okay, what can we really afford? And they said, well, here's the deal. You're going to really, based on your budgets, you're going to have to do 5 buildings, which happen to be all the same, 2 units downstairs, 2 units upstairs, so for 20 units total, 5 buildings. And that's pretty much what you can afford. These flats are pretty much what you can afford. And so they decided to go for it and do it. Because as they put it, this was what was important. It wasn't so much about the box. It was about getting together with my neighbors and having a good time. But here's what really unlocked was the key that unlocked the whole mystery, is that they said, here's the deal, Chuck. If you're upstairs and you break your knee, you can move into the common house. We have this really nice suite in the common house, really gourmet kitchen, really wonderful sitting room. You'll be in this 3,000 square foot house compared to your 1,000 square foot house. So, that's the consolation. Or if if you don't like that scenario, somebody downstairs will switch houses with you. You can move up, you can move downstairs, and somebody else will move upstairs. That's an agreement that we'll make before we moved in. So they managed to mitigate the concerns around this physical structure by using cooperation. And this software, really, compared to the hardware, made all that possible. I keep in close contact with these guys. They've been living there 10 years now. They've only had their very first person has got dementia. She still manages. She happens to live in the downstairs. That's all fine. She comes to dinner still. But the point is that instead of always thinking about the worst case scenario, think about how we can actually, implement our goals and live in a situation where we're having a good time as well, as opposed to waiting for all the stars to line up just right, because if you do wait for all the stars to line up, they just might not. And, but what really I appreciated about that so much is it wasn't about, the experts. Oh, we all have to have roll in this and roll in everything. It was about what they had decided. It was about them being self-deterministic and listening to themselves and getting into a very safe place and a somewhat facilitated situation. But the point is that they were empowered to make a decision that made sense for themselves, as opposed to listening to other people who would have not had them doing that. Maybe they would have put grab bars and wheelchair ramps in their house, but they still would have been lonely, and they still would not have had, the opportunity to be near and around people that they liked being around. I was always amazed whenever I visited senior co-housing. I always felt like if somebody knew something, everybody could know it. She was making cheese. She showed her neighbor how to make cheese, and she wanted to do some domestic work, so she took it up to the common house, and then others joined in. It was just a decision to make a social environment that made sense. This is the first senior co-housing project finished in the U.S. in Davis, California. And I'll never forget the day I was sitting there talking to them. She says, she's known her for 30 years, best friends, lived across town, almost never saw each other, a couple times a year, every few months, a few times a year, every few months. For the first time, she felt like she was able to be the best friend that she always wanted to be. Finally, she was the best friend that she had always wanted to be. Actually, this couple summed it up as well as any. I was visiting them in 1985. They were planning their one of the first senior co-housing projects. And I had just the previous day I had been to one of their planning sessions, and they were designing these really cute little 1,000 square foot houses, very, Paquito, Magnifico, well-designed, well-proportioned. And I walked into their house the next day, and they had this 3,000 square foot house. They had all this heirloom furniture, lowboys, credenzas, grandfather clocks, china cabinets. And my first reaction was, how can you leave all this? And she says, well, we decided, Mrs. Christensen, we decided that our life is going to be more interesting than all this stuff. We're not going to be relegated to curators for the next 40 years like our parents were curators for 40 years before that. And she was 65, homemaker. He was 67-year-old, recently retired high school principal. And she went on to say, statistically, she said, Chuck, statistically, one of us are going to die in 10 years. And statistically, the other one's going to live for another 10 years until the kids get tired of coming home for Easter, coming home for Christmas, coming home for my birthday, Mother's Day, on. And then one day they decide that, Mom, or Dad, we have to move you to assisted care because we can't take care of you as much as we'd like. And she says, you know what? We decided we wanted to be in control of our own future, not be sort of drift along until one day we can't be in control of our own future and somebody else has to be in control of our lives. So it's very self-deterministic. I mentioned earlier, the architecture. I was always amazed on these senior co-housing how far away the cars were from the houses. And over I heard people say, the cars, they're not going to get lonely out there. They can keep each other company. And this way we can stay connected to each other by our walk to and from our cars, our walk to and from the common house, our walk to and from the other houses without competing with cars, listening to cars, smelling cars, and all the rest. And the front porch is not feeling compromised on your front porch by the cars and having neighbors, the possibility of them stopping and and hanging out. You know, another interesting thing about these units that were on the upper floor, they figured out the prices themselves to these houses. They established the houses price on the second floors is $20,000 more than the bottom houses because they like the light and the air and all the and the view, etc. But they established that even with the stairs, the houses were more valuable upstairs. So again, it comes back to me as like sitting there and over a few months listening to people's values percolate, manifest into architecture. It's always surprising where it goes to, and it's always, in my feeling, much more responsive. Being able to see people come and go from the houses. People often ask, you know, in senior co-housing, who takes care of who? Exactly, how's that happen? And, you know, again, they establish their own priorities. Usually it's somebody who moves into a caretaker unit in the common house. When that arrives, they might take care of Mrs. Johnson for six hours a week and Mr. Smith for 8 hours a week. But they decide. They hire and fire anybody who does any of the caretaking. And the caretakers get to know them when they're, you know, pre-drooling. They get to know them as real people. I have to figure out another way to say that. But, you know, it's real. It's a little real. In this case, she was a retired nurse who lived in the co-housing, and she was hired to take care of people when they were ill. And it worked out fine on site. But this is the care that normally occurs. You know, it's just basically day in and day out, people just being there for each other. You know, there's usually 3 levels of care that happens in co-housing, in senior co-housing. One, all the things you agree that you'll do before you move in. Like, I'll pick up Mrs. Smith's medicine, I'll take her to the hospital and all that stuff. All the things you won't do. I'm not changing anybody's diaper, I'm not giving anybody a bath. And then there's all the things that you end up doing that you never imagined that you would do. And when I lived in Emeryville, we had a woman, 77, she died of breast cancer, and I had never imagined that I would spend so much time hanging out with her and talking to her, taking her coffee every morning, reading her the front page of the paper. But I had grown to appreciate this person as a real, you know, wonderful human being that I had grown to respect immensely. She played a significant role in helping that co-housing community get built, and she was a very much a contributing member to this neighborhood. For the most part, we had nothing in common. I mean, she was a rabid Republican, for example, but you know, it was a very human fact that she was dying, and I could make her life better, day in and day out, without having to think about it. I never felt like it compromised me or cramped my style. In fact, I felt like it was an honor to be able to participate in her well-being. Her 2 daughters lived across town. It was very difficult for them, not only because they had their own families, etc., but there was family history that made it more complicated. And it was very easy for us, and it was not a big deal, so it was easy enough. You know, I talk about the things that people have in common. I want to state, you know, that people have their own private house and their own private backyard, etc., etc. It's only about how to do things together. You know, I was visiting this one project, and I was amazed. There's a intergenerational co-housing next door. And the gardens were fallow. In this co-housing community, they were building the greenhouses. They built this place for their clothes to dry because, as one guy said, hey, you know, I've used a dryer my whole life. I decided I'm done with using dryers. I mean, so what if I'm retired? So what if it takes 2 days for my clothes to dry? What does it matter? I'm not going to do that anymore. But I was so amazed, next to an intergenerational co-housing, the gardens are fallow, there was, you know, stuff everywhere, and these guys were constantly building things and constantly doing stuff. I decided that 5 people with time can do infinitely more than 50 people with no time. But of course, they mostly did it to hang out and have a beer and play bocce ball. In the course of writing this last book, I visited a lot of regular assisted care as well, even, you know, independent care facilities. This happens to be a very expensive place in the Bay Area. And it wasn't very sophisticated research. I did spend 8 hours here one day. Rossmore is the name of it. And the research basically entailed walking up to people and say, hey, are you having a good time? So, you know, of course, after they got finished looking at me kind of funny, they would launch into a conversation. And this guy explained to me that he was, you know, it's fine, but He was really upset that they made him wear a dinner jacket to dinner every day. And I never found anybody who told me that they were having a good time. And then, of course, here's the craft room, and here's these two sewing machines back here. I could hardly be in that room long enough to take this photo. It's very expensive to move in here, a couple $100,000 plus 4,000 or 5,000 a month. That's not that terribly uncommon, moving into these assisted care. There's a bunch of people that I interviewed there. My daughter was hanging out. I could talk about nursing care all day. Co-housing in some ways is like living in a small town. My grandmother here was bedridden her last 10 years, but there were about 15 people who played a real role in her well-being for those last 15 years. And then that's not uncommon in a small town. This happens to be Downeyville, California. Along those lines, we had a heat wave in California a couple years ago. 35 seniors died over a couple days. 2/3 of them had air conditioning. That's the big surprise. But they didn't turn them on because, it's expensive and, costs money and da-da-da. There's only 3 things it takes to keep somebody alive in a heat wave. One is, even if they don't have an air conditioner, one is a damp towel, a fan, and a little fan to push the air, and somebody who cares, somebody who gives a damn. It's very simple, very low technology. And living in an environment where people care about each other on a fundamental level, in my view, starts right here. Sitting down with the future neighbors and prioritizing, how to make a neighborhood that makes sense. We just finished this project, 16 units in Boulder, Colorado. And I was so amazed when we were planning this project on 0.83 acres. We spent, a couple days on the private houses, a couple days on the common house. But what the group really grew to appreciate and spend an amazing amount of time on, 4 or 5 days, was really choreographing carefully this world between the houses, actually. Here's the common garden, here's the common workshop, outdoor area, an amphitheater, a stage, a outdoor sitting, outdoor kitchen. And, that's where the priority grew to be, is the world between the boxes. And they really do live there in between the houses. Jerry here, she told me that she moved into co-housing. Her husband died about 10 years ago, and she was losing her words. She's 84, and she wanted to live in a place where somebody could actually just stop by and chat, and it was simple and natural. They're a very active group together, actually. The youngest person moved in there at 51 years old, but they meet every morning at 10 o'clock and go for bicycle rides, etc. One of the things I really love about working on these senior co-housing is that these seniors are so impatient. They are. This woman told me recently, she said, "Chuck, I don't even buy green bananas anymore. Make this thing happen." She did, honestly. I mean, look at these guys. Are you done yet? Are you done yet? These guys are into it, though. This is a great couple right here. She's a quadriplegic, and he's blind. He pushes the wheelchair, and she tells him where to go. This is their common house. Dining, sitting, kitchen, workshop, laundry, an office, and upstairs they have, a caretaker unit. It's so interesting to me that these very young seniors, if you will, they figure it out. If they have any dialogue whatsoever, they say, "Look, let's make an apartment. We'll all pay for this apartment together, and a caregiver can move into that later if we need one." Well, Davis Co-housing, they figured, we'll need a caretaker maybe in 1 or 2 years. 1 month after they moved in, they needed a caretaker, and somebody moved in. But they moved in at an average age of 80 years old. So, but as I mentioned earlier, this group is as a community long before they moved in. Very conscious again. They said, "Chuck, make a full-scale drawing of a bathroom, and we're all going to get into a wheelchair and make sure we can get around." I mean, that's getting out of denial, basically. They're saying, "Look, we're all going to try it. We're going to see how it goes." This whole thing about community, it's kind of a nebulous term. It's hard to get your arms around it, hard to quantify, objectify. But because Christian here, this is the first co-housing community finished in the U.S., also in Davis, California. Very affordable. The unit started out at $89,000, but that was 1991. But because Christian's a quadriplegic, he was a party to this 100-kid study nationwide. And of the 100 kids, there were only 2 of them who had more interaction with people who weren't paid to be with them than people who were paid to be with them. 98 had more interaction with people who were paid to be with them than not paid. Their hairdresser, their physical therapist, their nurse, their doctor, their school teacher, more people hours per week with people paid to be with them. Christian, before he moved into co-housing, he had about 3 hours of peer interaction a week. And you can imagine how complicated it was for his parents to get his electric wheelchair, mostly his mother, into the car, make a play date, drive him around somewhere. Compared to now, you know, he wheels outside, and whenever I visit, I'm always amazed, whether they're playing tag or hide and seek or whatever they're playing. Christian is always included. There's no question about it. It's natural. It's the landscape basically, and there's no self-conscious efforts. It's very subconscious. I mean, it's just like what happens here. And previously, Christian lived in this neighborhood. You know, which is just down the street, interestingly enough, from the co-housing. One day I was walking down the street and I ran into somebody. And I asked this woman, I'm just curious, how long does it take to get to know your neighbor here? And she says, oh, about 5 years. And by that time, they've moved. I was showing this slide in Germany a couple years ago, and this guy says, Chuck, where's the front door exactly in these houses? And I said, well, you don't really need one. You know, you genie up the garage door, you pop your dinner in the microwave, you pop your movie in the VCR, and you're living. And that is a lifestyle. It's not terribly uncommon. But what I think is most interesting about this slide is that that is the same developer that did these 2 projects. Exact same woman. And the difference is that in this neighborhood, nobody was asked, what kind of a neighborhood would you like to live in? And in this neighborhood, somebody was asked. I'm getting to that other one. In this neighborhood, somebody was asked, what kind of a neighborhood makes sense to you? And in this neighborhood, it's all about the rearview mirror. What sold last time? What will the banks finance? You know, what's going on? You know, we build over 100,000 houses in California a year. Quite unfortunately, most of them look like this, and I'm a big advocate of, you know, rethinking that paradigm, frankly. But anyway, the biggest challenge that we have is the myth of the, you know, every man in his castle, no matter how small, and chariot, no matter how large, is the only paradigm in this country, or at least the only formula for success. You know, it's interesting. A few years ago, when we were writing the first book, Co-Housing, my father visited us in Denmark, and for 10 days. And before he came over, he kept saying, you know, now, why are you doing this exactly? Why are you bothering with this whole co-housing thing? I mean, you could have your own house. Why would you do this? And exactly, why would you do this? And he visited us for 10 days, and in those 10 days, you know, he cooked twice. He never had to cook at all. He, you know, got in there. That's where the action was. He was in there cooking with everybody else. He was the last person to leave the common house over those 10 days. I mean, where'd everybody go? 10 o'clock at night. Where'd everybody go? He was the last person in there. And then when he moved back to Sacramento, you know, immediately he's complaining all the time about nobody comes to visit. You know, why aren't you come and visit? Why don't you come over? And you know, and I don't know my neighbors. And why don't you come visit? And I said, Dad, well, why don't you just move into a, you know, co-housing? And he says, oh no, I could never do that. Oh, I could never do that. I mean, you know, that myth is so ensconced in our culture that it's like prying something that is very ensconced. And you know, in fact, I showed this slide. You know, if you're in Denmark for 13 months visiting co-housing, and you meet all these Danes, of course, and you tell them, hey, when you come to the U.S., come visit. You know, didn't expect to see any of them. But after this 23-hour odyssey of getting back to the U.S. Via airplanes and connections and all the rest, there's a couple Danes sitting on our front porch. So we tell them, you know, go away. We have to go to sleep and stuff. And so one of them walks around the neighborhood, and he comes back and he says, I found it. I found America. And he took a slide. This is his slide, Eric's slide. I had walked by this house forever and hadn't really noticed that caricature that he picked up immediately. It takes somebody from out of the culture sometimes to identify the culture. And in his view, this is it in a nutshell. You know, if you don't have your own house, you haven't made it. You're not grown up yet. And to get out of that box, unfortunately, is a pretty self-conscious act at some basic level. So I have to say, in writing this last book, it was really a great experience spending all these times with these seniors and hearing all their stories. The first 13 months that we were in Denmark, nobody broke down crying and, you know, bawling their eyes out, et cetera, telling about their experience before living in co-housing. The first 3 days of research on the senior co-housing, 2 people broke down crying, mostly contrasting their life before they lived in co-housing and after they lived in co-housing. And that whole exercise of getting very conscious about, you know, issues like mortality and actually talking about it so in a way that made it possible for them to honestly think about other responses than living in their private house, you know, thereafter, et cetera. So anyway, it was a really, really wonderful time spending times with these different groups and talking about their projects. And the rest of the stories in that book, by the way, which is brand new, and my sister's got there in the back of the house if anybody wants one. So thanks a lot. Appreciate it. I am. And I'm not going to touch the lights, I don't think. Let's see, I'm going to try one. Okay. Yeah, no, something. Okay. Sir.
I've got a couple. Are any of the, all of the co-housing units that you've shown are typically attached housing? Of the 120 that you mentioned, developments in the U.S., are any of them detached, or how many of them have detached dwellings?
A couple of them. One in Seattle. And interestingly enough is that one was started before our first book came out, and their second phase, they attached them, interestingly enough. And, you know, it's interesting, you know, and in my view, it comes greatly from the conversation. You know, we've designed a few straw bale houses, for example, and other kinds of groovy stuff. And so we go to these conferences every once in a while where people are talking about the groovy stuff, and they talk about, well, you know, my wall's got R25, R50, this different heat-resistant stuff. But when a co-housing group gets in there and they say, well, let's see, 2 party walls, assuming we can make it so you don't hear each other, that's our infinity. Let's see, I think that's as good as we're going to be able to do. So let's do that. In other words, it's very energy efficient to connect the houses. And it facilitates a sense of community because people are not so far away from each other. And it facilitates affordability. Typically, they're top 3 goals. So it doesn't take long for the dialogue. I was sure in Nevada City, California, a very rural county, actually. I was absolutely positive that how this was going to go. People were going to want to do, you know, more duplexes at most, very iconoclastic population. But once they had the dialogue, they decided, in fact, I was amazed watching them move the blocks up to closer. Well, let's see, affordability, community, energy efficiency. They just moved the blocks closer and closer and got to that 26 to 40 feet that I was talking about face to face for social reasons. And then sideways, they connected them for other, you know, goals and values that they brought to the table. So I really believe in the dialogue and how it manifests differently, a different landscape, you know, in the architecture. Sir, and then there was another guy. Sir.
2 questions. One is just if you could, I spent some time in Denmark, and my sense is that they're sort of like a whole family. They have a lot of values in common, very different from the U.S. And I suspect that that's an issue in the U.S. in trying to get people to be able to interact. And I wonder if you could talk about that. And the other one is about the importance of private open space. Do you find that it is an issue initially, continues to be an issue?
So glad I have a chalkboard here. I'll do the second one with the chalkboard. The first one, you know, yeah, the Danes, they have some things that they bring to the table. To some extent, some history of cooperating, for example, that's probably the most important one. But I think it's something that we need to learn. I'd suggest as a culture, it's like the #1 thing that we need to learn. So, you know, whatever we're going to accomplish, whether it's more environmentally responsive, you know, land use, or transportation, we're only going to figure that out via cooperation. And to the extent that we can still use fear and all the rest to divide us, I don't think we're going to get very far unless we start to get a culture of cooperation. And so, you know, when I think about it, I went to a lot of planning meetings there, and I noticed that they get a site plan done in about 3 days, and we take 4 days. So I started to feel like, well, you know, that's drawing together this little bit more diverse culture. But I've also noticed that over a couple days, a group gets into a mode. They actually, it's amazing what a quick study it is. In other words, they get into a mode of seeing about trying to figure out where their potential is as a community, and therefore reaching their potential as individuals too. I mean, end of the day, I hate to admit it, but I think that Ayn Rand is probably correct that we only do things for ourselves. But they get into this mode of really like, if I can figure out how to cooperate with you, my life's going to be better. And you start to see that happen by having discernible results day after day after day. And there's sort of, you see this subculture happen right away. I certainly have felt like that in the last 2 co-housing communities that I've lived in, where all of a sudden people are asking, hey, do you want to share a car? And all these cascading of possibilities that I don't think people had, you know, would have done previously. And they just starts to become part of the culture. In this case, a culture that's very, you know, it's got a scale that grows later. The second question, you know, I just came back from Maine, where I worked with a group on a site plan. They had bought 350 acres, this group of 30 households. So I was sure that these houses were going to end up all over hell and high water, because they were moving, lots of them, I mean, the ones that top of mind, the ones that came together was moving. One was moving from 50 acres, one was moving from 150 acres. One lived 20 miles out of Belfast, and then 4 miles down a dirt road. They were totally off the grid. You know, that's the kind of people that we were dealing with there. So I thought for sure, oh my God, what's this going to go like? It was really amazing to me that they got those 30 houses on 3.5 acres once they had the conversation. Once they had the conversation and they came to grips with the fact that, you know, sure, I could be, you know, one guy at one point said, Chuck, you know, I like this whole co-housing thing and everything, but I really don't want to hear the fall of my neighbor's axe. Anyway, at one point, you know, we did this exercise where we started to contrast and try to optimize the possibilities of privacy and community. Really saying that, okay, if we're going to have community, let's make that work. And I didn't quite put it in those terms. I have 4 days. But my job was to help them see the ramifications of the behavior. Really, it all starts with, what behavior do you want? And then let's do the architecture according to that. But anyway, if the behavior you want is community, let's not just play lip service to it. Let's talk about it. Then it's kind of like a conversation at some level. These houses are going to have a conversation, and there's some optimum distance, like caring about the neighbor who you had the conversation with the previous night. And if you're going to have this conversation, and this is the community, then let's make that work. But that has to be 100% balanced with the notion of, now I have this private side of my house. And by the way, the closer I move here to make the community work, the more privacy I have back here. So in other words, this conversation about, you know, if the houses are here, then the backyard could be bigger by virtue of this distance being smaller. And once that conversation starts to happen, you mean I can have more privacy by having more community when I choose? Then you start to, you know, the whole box thing starts to shift in a cascading fashion, where people start with, okay, the behavior that makes sense, let's translate that into an architecture that will actually, you know, make that behavior a reality. And I think it really pays to be very self-conscious in the planning phase. And you get into this habit of being very self-conscious, so that once you live there, you don't think about it. Hey, it's a Friday night, I've had the week from hell, I want to sit around with a couple of my neighbors and have a beer, I'm going to walk outside and make that easy to happen. Or, you know, I've had the week from hell and I don't want to talk to anybody. I'm over here. I spend the time on my own back porch, or I piddle in my own garden. Or if I feel like it, though, I'll go down and work in the common garden with other people. You know, always, and along the way, I'll say, hey, I'm going to go pick some potatoes. Do you want some potatoes? It's amazing how many people come along if you're giving away potatoes, for example. Ma'am, and then I'm not doing this in order, and I apologize. But you're next, sorry. Sorry?
Yeah, a decade ago, when I looked into co-housing, the zoning laws seemed to be a complication, especially the urban seemed to be easier, multi-family housing, and then the rural seemed to be almost impossible. Has that changed?
Oh, yeah. Kate, my sister and I, Diane, and Mike spent the morning with the planning department here, and you know, it's set up. It's set up unfortunate, in my view. The planning department is there to protect you, right? And so they don't really know what to do when you come to the table. So, you know, they're there to hold off the big bad developer. And believe me, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, at that moment, that's the habit. So you're like in this world, you get in that world as well. But anyway, you have to do some conversation and try to build a rapport and hopefully start to think about it differently. In the context of co-housing, the regulation effort does shift, usually at some point. It hasn't shifted anywhere near as, and unfortunately it's done very much on a project-by-project basis. You know, in Denmark now, planning departments, city councils, planning commissions go out of their way to attract co-housing communities to their towns, not new towns, to their towns, typically wherever they're trying to do a little redevelopment. They want to, you know, super catalyze, you know, a kid-friendly neighborhood or an elderly-friendly neighborhood or redevelopment, you know, and help these fledgling commercials do better, for example. And in the U.S., it's still like, oh, what do you want? Oh, can't do that. Oh, can't do that. Oh, can't do that. Oh. And then after a while, you sort of work your way in, and there you can hopefully grow a little bit of a arm-in-arm approach. And that's what you have to try to do. By the way, I don't want to forget to mention, by the way, because a couple people have left, the goal is to get a project, my goal, and my sister's goal, is to get a new project going in Eugene. Since our first book came out in 1988, I've probably gotten somewhere between 100 and 200 letters from people in Eugene saying, you know, we really want to get a co-housing, and there's been a fledgling project here and a fledgling project there. And, you know, other than Martin Henner, by the way, who's here, who's trying to get a new project started here in Eugene as well, none of them have manifested. So we're making one push here, and November 14th and 15th, we're going to do a 2-day workshop in Eugene. 2 days all about zoning issues and entitlement issues and finance issues and all the technical issues, including group process issues. Because really, if a group of people can't sit down together and make decisions, you know, one after another, then they're completely debilitated too. So it's going to be serious, you know, group process conversation around that as well. And where is that, Diane? Do we know? Lawrence Hall at the architecture department here. That's going to be November 14th and 15th.
Registration ahead of time, like by.
Yeah, and if you want, the best thing to do is to register with Diane tonight. Actually, theoretically, the costs are going to go up November 1st or something like that.
The cost will go up November 1st, but we still have to have about 20 still by November 1st.
So we're only going to do it if there's about 20 people signed up to do that workshop. So. Hopefully, you know, this is only a couple days. Well, the price is going to go up so we can actually plan for it. In other words, we hopefully in a couple days we'll know how many people are interested, and then after that, probably only a few more will sign up. So
if we get closer to 30, which is the maximum, the price will go down.
Right, exactly. Yeah, if we get close to 30, the price will go significantly down. So by a third, man. Okay, wait a minute. This guy's had his hand up for quite a long time. So, and I know that this would, by the way, this would never be a co-housing meeting. There would be somebody sitting right here who knows who was signed up first. But go ahead.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of new buildings here. Are there many people working on retrofitting what's already there? Filling in between some of these big old spread out houses and stuff?
Yeah, the one project, Emeryville Cohousing, they bought an old factory. Berkeley Cohousing actually bought 6 quite dilapidated houses, and then we built 8 new ones on the same piece of property, same 0.75 acres. It's a much more complicated thing to do. There's a project like that in Davis as well. It took 4 times longer than anything new we do. And the new part has a lot to do with a lot, including, that you can do it in a predictable timeline. You can do it on a predictable budget. And, energy conservation sometimes plays a role. But no, there's no reason whatsoever that a factory can't be a rehab. Sometimes, buildings are a little bit too vertical, but, if they have enough breadth to them, they can be retrofitted. That's just a feasibility question. In other words, it's almost case by case when it comes to retrofitting a building. And I spent 4 days in Phoenix where this group had identified 7 sites, and some of them made sense and some of them didn't make sense. So I just went down there with them. We kicked 4 of them out, and then we rated 3 of them very deliberately so that they would know the costs and how transportation oriented it was and all that stuff to figure out their feasibility. Now, let's see, ma'am. And then I know there was somebody else, then the guy in the sweater over there. Sorry.
Do most of the groups in your participate make decisions by consensus? And also, what do you do? I'll just say if someone's not just in decision making, but
The neighbor from hell.
Yeah.
Yeah, the consensus seems to be the mode for co-housing. I keep expecting that to shift a little bit. It has shifted a little bit in Denmark already, interestingly enough. One guy told me lately, we got bored with consensus. So we, we operate on consensus. And, I'm kind of a believer in consensus, believe it or not. Oddly enough. Even though I'm very much involved with trying to move projects along. But there's a couple reasons I really believe in it. One is that you really do make sure under those circumstances that all the ideas are on the table, basically. You really have proactively, in a way, made sure that everybody's, even the quiet person, they put their input on there. And then secondly, and this is especially true in the entitlement process, but secondly, once you've decided something, everybody's pretty much on board. You don't want a situation where, well, I never agreed to that anyway. You know what I mean? And they're kind of sandbagging and not really contributing to whatever is on board. And I feel, these projects, none of those co-housing projects that I showed took more than 9 months to get through the city, for example. And in fact, actually, that one in Katati that we got Best Growth Project in the U.S., that has 3 projects around it. The average time was 7 years to get approved and approved. But it was because there was regular development problems, of course. But I felt like there was several germane problems, like the market. The people that were trying to second guess the market all the time were always saying, "Oh, let's shift this and let's shift this," and they were always kind of trying to figure out where the market was. And in the case of the co-housing, the group decided this, and then we moved forward, and then we moved forward, and then they decided this, and we moved forward. It was very deliberate. When you get 35, 50 people in the room, you have to get pretty organized. There's nothing very, in a way, not that intuitive about it. There's a few intuitive things, but for the most part, you get pretty organized, and you have to be to keep it marching along, and I feel like that's what makes it work at so many levels. So as far as the neighbor from hell, it's interesting, and the question always comes up, and there's a couple things that happen. One is that, like, for example, Nevada City Cohousing. We had this guy in the group early on, a lawyer, and I'm nothing against lawyers. If you want to get against lawyers, we could talk about that some other time. But anyway, this guy was a lawyer, and he noticed meeting after meeting that not everybody was listening to him like he thought they should. And it took a couple meetings before he decided, well, this doesn't make sense for me because, well, they're not listening to me. He was used to a world where everybody listened to him, and people paid him big money to listen to him, actually. And they weren't listening to him, so he decided not to move in. He decided to move on. It turns out, if you can't get into the mode of, listening, starting with listening to your neighbor, there's a whole world out there just for you, basically. You don't have to listen. You can call the cops if they make too much noise. It happens. But if you can, imagine sitting around and you figure it out generally within a few weeks of joining a co-housing community, and whether it makes sense to you or not. In fact, actually, some guy told me recently. He says, before I moved into co-housing, he says I was so worried about somebody being a real pain in the ass. He says, but you know what? It's even worse than that. It could be that you're the pain in the ass. It's really interesting. He figured out, and I noticed after he moved in that, that it took him a little while before he figured out that, everything is not my way. I have decided recently that it's over a year or year and a half, there's always for me personally, there's always about a week that I'm sure I've got the best idea. Over let's say a year to 2 years, 56 to 112 months. Weeks, 56 to 112 weeks. There's always 1 week a year or every 2 years where I feel like, I've got the best idea. Whether it's cut the tree down, don't cut the tree down, I know, right? And they don't know. And why don't they listen to me? And you know what? I've decided that happens, and I'm always miserable for that week. Why don't they listen to me? But then, actually, that's not the worst part about it. The worst part is that I've decided that, even though previous to co-housing, I was from a very hierarchical world. You take orders, you give orders. There was none of this sitting around and shooting the bull and figuring it out, right? But I've decided one of the things that really works about co-housing is the basic math of 1 + 1 = 3. I have an idea, you have an idea, we put the idea on the table, and I'll be damned if it's not always better than my idea. It really irks me. So I get really mad the first time where they're not listening to me, and then secondly, I didn't have the good idea, it turns out. It turns out so that pisses me off. And so anyway, but it happens to everybody. So there's 57 adults in our community. So there's always somebody, 1 week, they're annoyed. It just happens. But you can decide, I've decided, like a lot of people say, you can decide to let it ruin your day or your week or not. That actually becomes a conscious decision too. Sir?
I've got a strong interest in farm-based eco-villages, high level of self-sufficiency and sustainability within the community. And wondering if you can speak at all to projects or to, I get caught in the quandary about how much to try to give it some form before I put out the idea that I'm interested in this. And
personally, if I were wanting to do a project like that, I personally wouldn't give it a lot of form before I just found other people who wanted to. The first feasibility question, there's always 3 basics to the foundation to a new feasibility study. Is there enough other people interested? What do they want to build? Can we afford to build it? Can we afford to buy it, basically? So the fundamental question is, quantifying in words what that minimum level of quote-unquote self-sufficiency is, and then going forward with that. We've done several projects now where there's a CSA associated to a co-housing next door to the co-housing. Interestingly enough, we did one in Atlanta. The co-housing group thought for sure they were going to farm these 5 acres. They were going to be farmers. It's going to be farming now, and they took less than a year. They leased off to a farmer, to a real farmer. They leased the whole site off to a real farmer. But it was a great idea, and they made something that they were very proud of, and there's a farmer there farming it now. But anyway, but they started off with that goal, and they made a nice community, and they have a farm next door. Well, it's interesting because, like our co-housing, our food production on site has tripled since October 2008, in the last year. And it's amazing, this farming thing, it's in the air now. So you're not going to get a co-housing group that's not interested in farming. It doesn't seem, if you put that out there, you'll get some interest. You'll get some serious interest. How much acreage you get perhaps will be, you'll have to reconcile that with some other goals, like how far from jobs, how much money do you have, stuff like that. But, you get together and you process that question, and you'll either have a project or not based on, having enough other people come to the table who want to participate, basically.
what's the place in Maine called?
Maine? Oh, Belfast. I think it's called Belfast Co-housing. And they plan on every kind of, they got cows and sheep and goats, and they're going to actually do a farmer's market on the weekend and all that stuff. They're serious about it. Okay, I'm going to try to get ma'am, and then I'll go back. And I'll be around if we feel like we have to adjourn. I'll be around for a while. I'm not. Where's our time line? What do we?
Well, we do have a commitment that soon.
Soon? Oh, okay.
I'm just curious about the interface with existing neighborhoods that have pretty good relationships. How can neighbors that are not in the cohousing,
Sometimes, it's funny. We have all these houses around our co-housing that want to participate in our co-housing, and there's people in our group like me who go, you know what? This is big enough. We don't really need 157 people. We need 57 is a lot of adults to figure out whether to cut the tree down or not to cut the tree down. I don't want to converse about it with any more. There's already taken me years to learn how to deal with this guy who's a nut, and I have to figure out how to deal with that. So however, that said, who was a nut last week and is my favorite person this week. But anyway, that said, it's amazing how many people I've met who have moved into this new co-housing site, and here's their common house, right? And he used to live right here, and and there's other neighbors who lived here and here. And for the first time, now he's moved here to this little co-housing unit. And previously, he didn't actually know this neighbor, but because the neighbor uses the common house now for common, neighborhood-wide meetings and for a dance party that we put on and for a Harvest Fest party and for a Halloween party and a New Year's party and all this stuff, all of a sudden, he knows this neighbor 100 times more than he used to. Because for the first time, this neighborhood has a real amenity that he has to share, and he gets to know the whole neighborhood as a result of it. So the relationships change, but they don't necessarily become co-housing esque relationships. Ma'am.
You talk about groups, but what are the nuts and bolts of how we get together?
Oh, that's great. Thank you for asking that. The reality is that any given of these 120 projects in the U.S., they all started with one person. I wish I had this slide of this couple in Denmark. The husband started this project. The wife came along kicking and screaming. It's senior co-housing. He unfortunately died 2 years after living there. She's lived there for 13 years now since. And I've got these slides of her spending a lot of time in the common house, and she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Usually it's just the opposite. The husband comes kicking and screaming, and then 3 weeks later he's got his feet up on the table talking about what a great idea he had. But it starts with every project starts with one person, and then
If you don't want to be that person, how do you find?
you just have to hope there's another that person then in your town. If there's not one of those people, then it won't probably happen. Every one of these projects I could point to one person and said, in the Berkeley co-housing though, very amazing. One guy, Tom Lent, he put an advertisement in the local free paper that said, I want to start a co-housing community in Berkeley based on the Danish model. That's all it said. And then he had 50 people come to the first meeting, and then 50 people come to the second meeting, and he had a project. So you would be one of those 50 under those circumstances if you didn't want to start it. But luckily, in Eugene, Diane Durrett is starting a project, wants to start a project here. So I would talk to her. That's what I would do if I didn't want to be that person. And she's got a history of actually accomplishing stuff that she sets out to do. So I have a lot of faith. And I would also talk to Martin Henner here.
Sir, how does investment and equity of the individual investor?
If you just wanted to be an investor?
No, I mean, people are going to live in there.
Oh, as your own personal real estate investment? Well, you're buying a condo, basically. Typically, they're a condo. There's 2 projects in the U.S. that have been financed by the National Co-op Bank, but that's less usual. Under co-op, and by the way, this is actually a big part of what we're talking about November 14th and 15th. It's like the key part. My wife is doing that. She's really hip to all the financing. I'm not as hip. She's going to talk a lot about how, they're mostly co-ops. You buy your box, if you will, and then you have an undivided share of the rest of the common facilities. Fortunately or unfortunately, we have had 2 units sell since we moved in, in Nevada City cohousing. You know, we bought the bloody things at the top of the market, absolutely the top of the market 4 years ago. Couldn't have been more expensive time. They bought those 2 3-bedroom houses for, each of them were $335,000. That was the top of the market. And they both sold them at the bottom of the market for $450,000. So unfortunately, with co-housing, there's a considerable amount of appreciation, mostly because there's not a lot of supply. Once one gets built in your neighborhood, there's plenty of demand, not enough supply. Somebody else has to go out and go talk to the planning department all day and, you know, all that BS. And so, so typically across the U.S., there's a considerable amount of appreciation. So as an investment, it doesn't make a bad impression, but you know, a lot of people like myself, you know, aren't in it for the investment. You know, we plan to live there. It's actually housing. It's my house, you know, and I'm not in it to flip it and make money. There are people who, and that's another reason that there's a lot of demand, is because the turnover is a lot less. I mean, there's statistics, and it's like 1/10 of what a typical street is. I mean, if you look at the Sacramento co-housing, that one I showed, it was 5 years before the first person had moved out. So it's not, and that's for 25 houses. So that's not one every 7 years. I forget what that number is, if somebody did the ratio, but I think it's close to 1/10, or maybe it's at least an 1/8 kind of ratio of turnover. So as an investment, you know, I don't know if it's the kind of thing I would do for investment. It doesn't make sense at some level because nobody moves into it planning to make money, but it does happen. You end up with a dream job across the country. We had a person move out because she became the head nurse at a hospital in Washington, D.C., and she couldn't pass up the job, so she took it and, you know, and made money in her house. Can't begrudge her of that. There have been projects, however, Berkeley Co-Housing, I was very impressed. They put on a self-imposed, by consensus, put in a 5% cap on their appreciation every year. If you sell it 5 years later, you're only making 25%. You know, unlike you know, any other co-housing, it's whatever the market will bear. So I was pretty impressed that they decided to do that by consensus. So who else? Sir?
Are there any co-housings that include animals? Like now, do you use them for explaining them, but because they have, because you've got a lot of animals, like vegan co-housing or something like that? You know any?
Well, you know. Oh, well, yeah. We have 13 dogs. Sometimes I think it's a couple too many, but there's a lot of animal lovers and cats, and we have 20 chickens or more. You know, for eggs. A lot of you know, the co-housing, like the Belfast, they plan to have one, you know, where they have a little bit more of an agrarian history in that area. They end up with an animal or 2, cows. I expect one of these days there'll be a equestrian co-housing. I wouldn't be surprised. But because every once in a while somebody will come along and ask something about that. But as far as like a vegan co-housing, you know, anything like that's possible, assuming you can find the critical mass number of people. I mean, if you get 20 people at the table and says, hey, I want to make a vegan co-housing, then you're good to go. But, you know, you know, you're just, you know, you're kind of going counter to the probability, just the numbers. I mean, you know, Eugene, 142,000 people in this town, doesn't have one co-housing yet. I wouldn't start off by having a limited population. I'd be saying, okay, who's at the table? Who wants to get together and figure out what makes sense on a broader population than a narrow population? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Chuck, we should just have maybe one more.
One more, is that all right? How about 2? Is that all right? The 2 red coats.
Do any projects that have like mixed income or low mod income?
They're all mixed income. They're all amazingly mixed income. Diane, hold up that book of the new intergenerational cohousing. The new senior cohousing. That book right there, actually, that project on the cover, you should look at it. It just won the most affordable senior housing project in the U.S. By the AIA, the American Institute of Architects. We have 6 units there in Boulder, downtown Boulder, that $100,000, which is kind of amazing for Boulder, Colorado. 4 units are $750,000. I mean, look at that range. It's amazing. But you know what? One of my favorite parts of working with co-housing groups, there's co-housing units in the U.S. as low as 50,000, and I think there's going to be one soon with a new one in Boulder that they go up to $1 million. But you know, one of the things I really love about working with these projects is it's like who's at the table and what are we going to strive to accomplish? I mean, I'm happy. You know, Bellingham Co-Housing, it was started by a woman who makes $25,000 a year. She went out and got 3 other people to help her buy this site so that she could start a project. 25, single mom, but she was like a mama bear. She, right out of the chute, she says, here's the deal. I'm not raising my kid by myself. She brought that value to the table and she pushed for it and she made an incredible co-housing community. And you know, she bought her unit, I think it was like $90,000. It's a very cheap little cute unit. But you know, it's like who's at the table? Let's do that. Whatever you guys want to do. Ma'am.
I was involved locally developing a intentional community in the 80s here with a spiritual focus based more on the Israeli model of kibbutz moshavim. I'm wondering if you have experience with some of the co-housing communities where there's a fuller intentionality that includes employment, businesses, kid care, spiritual prayer space, like a village that's filled out more with the broader intentionality of supporting people.
Yeah, you know, that could be something else other than co-housing, even though there's gray areas. And, you know, for example, in our co-housing, there's every kind of you know, casual economy going on, whether it's massages or we've had childcare in our common house, and one parent gets paid by the other parents to do childcare, and but not in co-housing, not normally a spirituality sort of thing, and not nearly as economically oriented as a kibbutzim, more like the moshav in Israel for sure. And where it's basically a neighborhood, and what evolves out of that neighborhood later on is kind of organic, but not so much intentionality in co-housing. It's interesting because somebody recently says, well, you know, Chuck, there's been tribes and, you know, villages forever. Why is co-housing as a community concept different? Well, it's different because, you know, in Denmark in the early 70s, these were folks who just got together and said, okay, you know, demographics are different. Mom's working outside of the house now, don't have 6 kids anymore, have 1 or 2 kids. Demographics are different. Life is different. Let's figure out a neighborhood that makes sense for late 20th century as opposed to yonder and you know, the concepts of how we're supposed to live, etc. Those, when it makes sense, they'll whatever makes sense to them, they'll embrace it if it makes sense generally to all of them. We have done 2 projects. One group was from a Methodist church and one group was from a Unitarian church, did 2 co-housing. But it's interesting, they don't practice any spirituality on site, but they started the projects and they have simply broadened their spirituality on site based on all the other party that came to the table. And by the way, for example, the Unitarians in Fresno, they got to live with the Unitarians, and that made the Unitarian church is right next door. We happen to have designed that too. And they have all these other neighbors as well. But so it was able to, you know, at some level fulfill some of their spiritual interests, but also broader, and they decided not to be that self-conscious about it on site. So anyway, hey, thanks very much, you guys. Appreciate it. Talk to Diane if you're serious about making a new project.
Introduce you to our architect.
Oh, hi. How are you? Good to meet you. How are you?